Henry Wallace was 62, a retired math teacher who'd spent most of his life in the same small Midwestern town. His days were simple now. Morning coffee, a crossword at the diner, and long walks past streets he knew like the back of his hand. He wasn't looking for trouble, but sometimes trouble doesn't ask permission. That Thursday night, he sat on his porch with a mug of tea, watching the church across the street. St. Matthew's had been there longer than Henry had been alive, its tall steeple a kind of anchor for the town. But lately, something about it fell off. The lights inside burned later than usual, long after the evening service was done. Then he saw it. Two men, silhouettes in the dark, carrying a heavy crate through the side door. A third man followed, locking it behind them. No one noticed Henry sitting quietly in the shadows, but his stomach tightened. Churches weren't for midnight deliveries. He told himself it wasn't his concern, yet he didn't look away. The longer he watched, the heavier the sense that something was wrong pressed on him. And for the first time in years, Henry felt that old itch, the one that used to drive him to dig deeper when a student's story didn't add up. Only this time, the numbers he was staring at weren't homework. They were shadows. The next night, Henry tried to tell himself he wouldn't watch. He even turned on the television, some crime drama rerun, but his eyes kept drifting to the window. Curiosity is a hard habit to kill, especially for a teacher who spent decades searching for the missing piece of an equation. Around midnight, the same door at the side of the church creaked open. This time, Henry was ready. He switched off his porch light, slipped into the shadows, and watched from behind his hedge. Two men appeared again, both in dark jackets, faces hidden under baseball caps. They moved quickly, like men who knew what they were doing. But the crate they carried wasn't the same size as before. Smaller, yet they treated it with care, as though it might break or spill. A van idled in the alley. No lights, just engine rumbling low. The men disappeared inside the church, and when they came back, they weren't carrying the crate. They left empty-handed, climbed into the van, and drove off without headlights until they hit the main road. Henry stood there in the cool night air, heart beating faster than he liked to admit. He'd lived across from that church for 20 years and never once saw a delivery after dark. Something was happening inside those walls, and it wasn't holy. By Saturday evening, Henry couldn't shake it anymore. He'd seen too much to brush it off as charity work or late-night church business. He needed context, a face to put with the mystery. And when he thought of St. Matthew's, one face came to mind, Pastor John Harlan. Henry remembered him as a boy, quiet, shy, always sitting in the back row of his math class. John wasn't the kind of kid who caused trouble. He kept his head down, scribbled in notebooks, and flinched when other boys laughed at him. Henry used to encourage him, telling him numbers were a language that never lied. John had smiled at that once, small but genuine. Now John was 40, respected, polished. He wore tailored suits, spoke with confidence, and filled the pews every Sunday. Folks in town admired him, said he'd brought new life into the church. But Henry had watched his eyes during sermons, sharp, almost calculating, like he was measuring more than souls. Sitting in his kitchen that night, Henry leafed through an old yearbook until he found John's picture. A skinny kid with hollow cheeks and nervous eyes. Hard to reconcile with the man carrying the town's faith on his shoulders now. Henry set the book down, unease crawling through him. If Pastor John was running the show at St. Matthew's, then those midnight deliveries weren't just a mystery. They were a problem. Monday morning at the diner, Henry sat in his usual booth by the window, stirring sugar into his coffee he wouldn't finish. Conversations carried through the small place. Farm prices, last night's football game, the usual chatter. But one voice cut through the noise. "Did you hear about Tommy Rhodes?" A waitress whispered to a customer at the counter. Henry's hand froze. Tommy was 16, one of the kids Henry used to tutor in algebra after school. A good kid, quiet, always polite, though sometimes distracted like his mind was elsewhere. His mom says he never came home Friday night, the waitress went on. Sheriff thinks he ran off to the city, but she swears he wouldn't. Henry felt the words drop heavy inside him. He pictured Tommy's nervous smile, the way he'd triple-check his answers before handing over homework. That boy wasn't a runaway. He tried to shake it, but the images clashed. Tommy's face and those late-night crates slipping into the church basement. He didn't want to believe there was a connection, but his gut told him otherwise. Numbers didn't lie, and neither did instincts honed by decades of watching kids too closely to miss the truth. Henry left money on the table and stepped into the cold air. For the first time in years, he felt like the town he knew so well was hiding something he didn't. And that thought chilled him more than the November wind. Henry started small. At the barber shop that afternoon, he brought up Tommy's name, careful like dropping a pebble in still water. "Shame about that Rhodes boy," he said, watching the old men in the chairs. The barber, Sam, shrugged without meeting his eyes. "Kids run off sometimes. Nothing new." But another man, Cliff, who'd worked the mill until it closed, shifted uncomfortably. "Not Tommy," he muttered. Then he caught himself, cleared his throat, and buried his nose back in the paper. Henry pushed a little. "Strange things happening at St. Matthew's, too. You ever notice?" Sam's eyes snapped up, sharp for the first time. "Careful, Henry. Folks around here don't take kindly to gossiping about the church." The words hung heavy, like smoke that wouldn't clear. Henry nodded, pretending to drop it, but inside his gut tightened. It wasn't just disinterest. It was fear. Later that evening, at the grocery store, he mentioned it again, lightly, to the cashier he'd known for years. Her smile faltered, and she whispered, "Don't go digging, Mr. Wallace. Some things you're better off not knowing." Henry drove home with groceries he didn't need, headlights carving the dark streets. Everyone's reactions told him the same thing. There was more to the story. And if the town was this scared of shadows, then maybe the shadows were real. Sunday morning, Henry put on the same gray blazer he'd worn to graduations and funerals. He hadn't been to service in years, but if answers lived anywhere, they'd be behind those heavy wooden doors. St. Matthew's was packed. Families in their best clothes, choirs singing soft hymns, sunlight filtering through stained glass. On the surface, it looked like any other Sunday. But Henry felt a different current beneath the smiles, an edge, like everyone was performing a part. Then Pastor John stepped up to the pulpit. His voice filled the church, smooth and practiced. "We are a community of light," he said, "and in these troubled times, we must trust the path laid before us." The crowd nodded, hanging on his every word. Henry studied him. The suit fit perfectly, the hands moved with precision. But it was the eyes that unsettled him, sharp, scanning, like he was measuring more than faith. When his gaze swept the congregation, it lingered for a fraction on Henry. Recognition or a warning? The sermon ended with applause. People smiled, shook hands, left uplifted. But Henry walked out into the cold morning air with a knot in his chest. The boy he once knew was gone. The man at that pulpit wasn't preaching hope. He was guarding something. And Henry knew he wasn't imagining it anymore. That night, Henry couldn't sit still. The image of Pastor John's eyes had lodged in his head like a splinter. By 10 o'clock, he was pacing the living room, lights off, blinds open just enough to watch the church across the street. Near midnight, movement. A side door opened, spilling a sliver of yellow light onto the frosted grass. Two figures slipped inside. A moment later, the light shifted downward, not upward. Basement. Henry crossed the street, slow and quiet, heart pounding in his ears. He stayed low by the hedges, close enough to hear faint sounds leaking through the cracked foundation vent. Voices. Male, muffled, tense. Then another sound cut through, sharp and unmistakable, a stifled sob. He froze, the kind of sound that doesn't belong in a church at night. Henry crouched by the vent, straining to catch words. He couldn't make them out, but the tone was wrong, commanding, harsh. Another sob, weaker this time. His stomach turned. Before he could linger, a door slammed inside. Heavy footsteps crossed the basement floor. Henry backed away into the shadows, chest heaving. Back on his porch, he wiped sweat from his brow despite the cold. It wasn't suspicion anymore. He'd heard it, crying, in the basement of a church. And if he was right about who it belonged to, then Tommy Rhodes wasn't just missing. He was trapped. The next morning, Henry drove to the sheriff's office, a brick building with peeling paint and a flag that hadn't been replaced in years. Inside, behind a cluttered desk, sat Tom Keller, a man Henry had known since high school. Tom had been a lanky kid who struggled with algebra. Now he was the sheriff with a gut pushing against his belt. "Henry Wallace," Tom said, half smiling. "Haven't seen you since the 4th of July parade. What brings you in?" Henry leaned forward, lowering his voice. "It's about the Rhodes boy. Tommy. I think I know where he is." Tom's smile faded. "Careful what you say, Henry. I saw things. At St. Matthew's. Crates at night, men going in and out, and," he hesitated, the memory tightening his chest. "Crying. From a basement." For a moment Tom just stared. Then he sighed and rubbed his temples. "You don't know what you're stepping into. The church is complicated. Folks with power are tied to it. You push too hard, you're going to get burned." Henry gritted his teeth. "So you're telling me to ignore it?" Tom met his eyes, tired but firm. "I'm telling you. For your own good, don't dig. Not here. Not now." Henry left the office feeling heavier than when he'd walked in. If even the sheriff wouldn't act, then it meant one thing. He was on his own. That night, Henry didn't bother with sleep. He dug his old camcorder out of the hall closet, the one he used years ago to record school plays and graduations. The battery barely held a charge, but it would do, if no one would believe his word. Maybe they'd believe what he could show them. Just after midnight, he crossed the street again, moving slower this time, hugging the fence line. The camcorder felt heavy in his hands, more like a weapon than a tool. He crouched low near the foundation vent where he'd heard the crying before and switched the camera on. It didn't take long. Headlights cut through the dark, then vanished as a van pulled into the alley beside the church. 2 men got out, dragging a third figure between them, a boy, maybe 16, with a hood pulled over his head. He stumbled, fought weakly, but they shoved him through the side door. Henry's hand shook, but he kept the lens steady. He zoomed in, capturing faces, the boy's sneakers scraping the concrete, the flash of a ring on one man's hand. Enough detail to matter. When the door slammed shut, Henry exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath the whole time. He had proof now. Real proof. But as he hurried back to his porch, one thought hammered in his skull. Proof was dangerous. Proof meant he was next. The following morning, Henry drove 2 towns over, camcorder on the passenger seat, wrapped in an old flannel shirt. He knew better than to bring it to the local paper. Too many ties, too many friendly handshakes with the church. Instead, he went to see Carl Dawson, a regional reporter he'd met years back when the school board was under investigation. Carl had been young then, hungry for a story. Carl met him in a diner booth, still sharp-eyed but heavier, with a tiredness Henry recognized. He listened as Henry laid it out, then slid the camcorder across the table. "It's all there. You'll see." Carl watched a few minutes of the tape. His expression changed. His legs started bouncing under the table. Then he shut it off, pushed it back, and shook his head. "I can't run this." Henry stared at him. "What do you mean you can't? That's a kid being dragged into a church basement." Carl lowered his voice. "You don't understand, Henry. These people aren't just preachers. They've got donors, politicians, judges. If I print this, it's not just my job on the line. It's my family." Henry felt his stomach twist. "So you're saying it doesn't matter?" Carl met his eyes, and for a flicker, Henry saw fear. "I'm saying be careful. You're in deeper than you think." Henry drove home with the camcorder still wrapped in flannel, the weight heavier than before. 2 nights later, there was a knock at Henry's door. It was late, too late for a neighborly visit. He opened it to find a woman standing there, her coat thin against the cold, eyes red from crying. He recognized her instantly. Margaret Rhodes, Tommy's mother. "Mr. Wallace," she said, voice trembling. "I heard you've been asking questions." Henry let her in, made coffee she didn't touch. She sat at his kitchen table, twisting a tissue in her hands. "They won't help me," she whispered. "The sheriff, the school, even the paper, they all say the same thing. That he ran off. But I know my boy. He wouldn't." Her eyes filled again. "Someone told me you saw something. Please, is it true?" Henry hesitated. Every instinct told him to keep quiet, to protect her, to protect himself. But then he remembered the sound he'd heard through the vent, that broken sob in the dark. He nodded slowly. "I don't have all the answers, but I know your son didn't just run away." Margaret reached across the table, gripping his hand with surprising strength. "Then we can't stop. Not until he's back. For the first time since this began, Henry realized he wasn't entirely alone, and that, somehow, made the danger feel even more real. They waited until Sunday night. Margaret insisted on coming, no matter how much Henry tried to talk her out of it. "He's my son," she said flatly. "If something happens, I need to be there." The church was dark by 11, the parking lot empty. Henry led her around the side, flashlight in his pocket, camcorder slung over his shoulder. His hands shook, not from age this time, but from fear. The side door wasn't locked. That alone made Henry's stomach turn. He eased it open, the hinges groaning softly. Inside, the air was damp, heavy with the scent of old wood and something sourer. They crept down the narrow stairwell, Margaret clutching his arm so tightly he felt her nails through his coat. From below came voices, low, chanting almost, mixed with the scrape of something dragging across the floor. And then, clearer than anything, a cry. Young, desperate. Margaret's breath hitched. Henry put a hand over hers, motioning for silence. His heart hammered so hard he feared it would give him away. At the bottom of the steps, a door glowed faintly with light seeping through the crack. Henry leaned close, straining to see. What he glimpsed made his blood run cold. There, in the center of the basement, was Tommy, bound to a chair, eyes wide with terror. Henry pushed the door open before Margaret could stop him. It slammed against the wall, and for a split second the room froze. For men stood around the basement, Tommy tied to a chair in the middle. At the far end, Pastor John turned slowly, his face calm, his hands clasped behind his back like he was about to start a sermon. "Well," John said, his voice smooth as glass, "our guest has arrived." Margaret rushed past Henry, crying out her son's name. Two of the men moved to block her, but Henry stepped forward, the old camcorder in his hand raised like a weapon. "It's over, John," he said, his voice shaking but loud. "I've got proof. Every word, every face. People will see what you've done." John's smile didn't falter. "You think anyone will believe a tired old teacher and a desperate mother? We're the church, Henry. We are the pillars of this town." Henry's hands trembled. His knees screamed with pain, but he stood firm. "No," he growled. "You're just men hiding behind walls. And tonight those walls crack." The room erupted. One man lunged, knocking the camcorder from his grip. Margaret screamed. Henry swung wildly, fists and elbows, the years of discipline in a classroom turning into raw survival. He got at Tommy, yanked at the ropes, but a blow to the back sent him sprawling. The world went white with pain. The last thing he saw before darkness crept in was Pastor John's face, no longer calm, but twisted with fury. When Henry came to, the world was chaos, sirens wailing, boots pounding above, voices shouting orders. His head throbbed, vision blurred, but he felt cold concrete beneath him. Somewhere nearby Margaret was crying, but this time with relief, not fear. He forced his eyes open. Two deputies were leading Tommy up the stairs, a blanket around his shoulders. The boy looked shaken, pale but alive. Margaret clung to him like she'd never let go again. Henry tried to push himself up, but pain knifed through his ribs. He fell back with a grunt. A paramedic knelt beside him, flashlight in hand. "Easy, sir. You've got a couple broken ribs, maybe worse. Just stay still." Through the haze, Henry saw Pastor John being dragged out in handcuffs, shouting scripture that sounded more like curses. The other men followed, heads down, their power stripped away in an instant. Sheriff Tom appeared over him, face lined with shame. "You were right, Henry. I should have listened." Henry managed a weak smile, though every breath hurt. "Numbers don't lie, Tom, and neither do kids' cries." As they loaded him into the ambulance, Henry caught one last glimpse of the church, its steeple rising against the night sky. Once it had been a place of faith. Now it was a crime scene. The pain in his body was sharp, but beneath it ran a quiet pride. He'd paid a price, yes, but Tommy was alive. The truth was out, and the shadows in the church were finally dragged into the light.